recherche ou un institut de Mines Paris, l'école de mines de Paris, qui elle-même fait partie maintenant de PSL, Paris Sciences et Lettres. Petite histoire sur le master, donc en l'an 1 avant le Covid, donc si vous calculez un peu, c'était en 2018, l'IHE, je n'étais pas encore à l'IHE à l'époque, avait ouvert un master spécialisé Deeptech Entrepreneur, ou Second Life, dont Bruno et Nicolas étaient deux étudiants. Bruno il sera là aujourd'hui aussi, donc il va peut-être parler de Sublime Énergie. Et l'objectif, c'est de créer des startups. Donc c'était des gens qui avaient déjà fait une carrière professionnelle, qui voulaient changer de carrière et porter un projet, mais ils n'avaient pas d'idée. Et on les mettait en relation pendant l'année d'études avec des laboratoires de recherche de l'école des mines, qui avaient des brevets, des innovations, et Sublime Énergie est né comme ça. Comme je disais, l'an 1 avant Covid, après le Covid est arrivé. Du coup, ce programme, il s'est arrêté. Le contexte a changé. Donc, il y a 2 ans, il y avait France Relance 2030, donc qui investit beaucoup d'argent pour la Deeptech, avec le plan de Deeptech, donc la BPI, donc il y a Pascal Ribon qui sera avec nous vendredi. L'objectif, c'est de créer 500 startups Deeptech par an. Donc actuellement, on est à 320, si je ne me trompe pas, pour réindustrialiser la France, entre autres. J'ai trouvé aussi un rapport de France Stratégie d'octobre 2021 sur l'emploi dans les startups françaises et qui disait qu'il y a un besoin de profils adaptés. Donc du coup, on se trouve dans un contexte où il y a un besoin de création de startups technologiques et un besoin de former des profils pour intégrer les startups technologiques. Donc le master qu'on avait, qui s'était arrêté, on l'a transformé et on a créé le master spécialisé Entrepreneur Deeptech Innovation il y a 2 ans et on a ouvert donc, la première promo l'année dernière. Donc c'est Cédric Denirami qui vient d'arriver, vice-président de PSL qui va dire 2 mots tout à l'heure, Benjamin Cabane qui est en route et moi-même qui porte ce projet. Alors l'objectif de la formation, je l'ai déjà dit un peu, c'est aider à la création des startups. Donc les gens, donc la promo, on a des gens qui ont des projets de start-up actuellement. C'est aussi former des jeunes scientifiques ou des jeunes avec d'autres backgrounds. Il y a ingénieurs formés à l'entrepreneuriat et à l'innovation. Et accompagner aussi les start-up. Donc les start-up qui ont besoin de profils spécifiques, ils peuvent venir nous voir et on peut fournir des personnes dont ils ont besoin. Donc pour venir faire notre formation, soit vous voulez intégrer l'écosystème l'innovation en Deep Tech, vous formez dans l'innovation technologique, ou vous venez nous voir carrément avec un projet de start-up technologique et on va vous former, et vous accompagner et vous aider dans cette aventure. Module de formation, je ne vais pas les détailler, il y a une plaquette à l'extérieur, vous pouvez prendre la plaquette et regarder un peu. Cette année, on a adapté un peu avec l'input de la promo actuelle pour changer un peu, modifier un peu, améliorer le contenu de la formation. Les modalités, donc c'est une formation professionnalisante, une formation alternée, donc ça veut dire qu'il y a 1 semaine de cours par mois, et sur 10 mois. Et puis en été, donc il y a 2 mois de travail sur la thèse professionnelle. C'est une formation sur 1 an, master spécialisé, donc Bac plus 6, avec une soutenance en fin d'année. Et donc les personnes qui suivent les cours pendant 1 semaine, pendant 3 semaines, ils ont soit une mission professionnelle au sein d'une start-up Deep Tech ou au sein d'un organisme de l'écosystème Deep Tech, où ils travaillent sur un projet de start-up et tout en combinant, pour certains d'entre eux, avec une activité professionnelle. Les points forts de la formation, bien sûr, apport de connaissances et acquisition de compétences par les cours des professeurs des mines et beaucoup de professionnels qui viennent faire les cours de la formation. Un accompagnement individualisé et personnalisé. Aux mines, on a des petites promos dans nos masters spécialisés et même les ingénieurs, c'est pas des gros groupes. Et ça permet donc de faire un accompagnement individualisé, personnalisé. On donne accès à l'écosystème et au réseau professionnel de PSL, Mines Paris et l'IHE. Pour donner un exemple, j'organise beaucoup de déjeuners pendant la semaine de cours avec les étudiants et avec des gens de l'écosystème de l'innovation. Donc ça peut être des fondateurs, ça peut être des directeurs des incubateurs, ça peut être des financiers, ça peut être des chercheurs. Donc c'est toujours intéressant. Et bien sûr, les personnes qui font notre formation, ils deviennent alumni des Mines Paris. Et donc aujourd'hui, on a Philippe qui est avec nous, le président de l'association, qui est partenaire de cette semaine et qui nous a mis en relation avec pas mal de startups qui sont portées par des anciens de l'école. Donc il y a des stands, il y aura des stands à l'extérieur. Information pratique, c'est aussi sur la plaquette. Donc j'ai déjà tout détaillé plus ou moins. Hein. Petit remerciement. Remerciement PariSanté Campus qui nous ont accueillis tout au long de l'année. On a donné des cours aux mines, mais aux mines, il y a actuellement des travaux. Donc, il y a des salles indisponibles. Et quand on a une salle, il y a du bruit. Et donc, du coup, c'est aussi pertinent pour nous d'être dans un écosystème innovation, certes santé, mais ça permet aussi aux étudiants, et surtout deux étudiants qui ont un projet dans la santé, d'être en contact avec des personnes de cet écosystème-là. Alumni Mine Paris, merci pour l'aide dans l'organisation et les contacts pour les gens, pour les tables rondes et les stands. Les équipes IHE PSL et bien sûr les étudiants de notre master pour l'organisation de ce forum. Dernier petit slide, l'écosystème du master spécialisé. Si vous n'êtes pas dessus, vous voulez être dessus, vous me contactez. Voilà. Je donne le micro à Cédric qui, je pense, souhaite dire deux mots aussi.
Merci beaucoup. Oui, mais je vais simplement dire deux mots de remerciements comme je l'ai fait hier. Les remerciements seront évidemment d'abord adressés aux étudiants de la promotion en cours qui ont organisé ce DeepTech Forum. L'objectif de l'organisation de ce DeepTech Forum, même si la période est évidemment chargée entre le Bourget, Vivatech et un certain nombre de choses, c'est d'avoir un rendez-vous, de lancer un rendez-vous annuel autour des technologies et autour de l'innovation et de l'entrepreneuriat DeepTech. Voilà, donc c'est évidemment cette occasion-là et de se retrouver chaque année autour d'un événement. Donc c'est aujourd'hui un événement, j'en suis assez fier et qui sera fondateur dans notre écosystème pour avoir un moment dans lequel aujourd'hui, lorsqu'on fait de la tech ou lorsqu'on fait de la technologie, on reste quand même très superficiel. Vous avez vu, Vivatech se réjouit de concurrencer le CES de Las Vegas, qui est une bonne nouvelle pour notre écosystème. Mais l'idée, c'est qu'aujourd'hui, nous, on est plutôt sur des questions de voir comment la recherche peut amener à des questions d'impact, comment la recherche peut développer des technologies, comment est-ce qu'on peut créer des entreprises, ces fameux techno-push, ces créations d'entreprises à partir de ça. Et donc là, il y a un enjeu très très fort aussi pour nous, qui est d'amener cette recherche jusqu'à les applications, les créations d'entreprises. Je le rappelle juste en quelques chiffres. Si vous prenez, et c'est l'occasion aussi de remercier Philippe Calousian, le président des alumni des mines aujourd'hui, vous prenez l'école des mines, aujourd'hui c'est 300 chercheurs permanents qui développent de la recherche, qui développent des brevets, qui développent des technologies. Si vous prenez l'université PSL, aujourd'hui c'est 3000 chercheurs dont une partie sont présentes ici sur les thématiques d'intelligence artificielle, d'IA, mais évidemment d'autres sujets autour de la santé numérique. Et donc pour nous, l'enjeu, il est là. L'enjeu, il est de savoir comment est-ce qu'on va être capable d'accompagner ce mouvement de création d'entreprises technologiques. Donc non pas simplement des applications qui répondent à un besoin marché, mais des technologies qui ont souvent des temps de développement de 5, 10 ans, 15 ans, avec des innovations de rupture. On a un momentum qui est exceptionnel, vous le savez, lorsqu'on regarde aujourd'hui sur l'annonce du président de la République avec le France 2030, on a 11 startups sur les 125 qui sont issues de l'écosystème PSL. La plupart sont issus des laboratoires de recherche sur des éléments deep tech, ce qui n'aurait pas été possible il y a 10-15 ans. Pourquoi ? Parce que les investisseurs étaient un petit peu frileux aussi. L'argent du capital risque est arrivé. L'argent du capital risque est arrivé et est venu massivement financer des technologies. Et d'ailleurs, ce sera du coup la thématique aujourd'hui qu'on abordera, puisqu'aujourd'hui, on regardera un petit peu comment les technologies pour le climat, qui elles ont besoin aussi d'argent d'investissement massif, étaient peu présentes il y a une quinzaine d'années. Et aujourd'hui, on en observe une vraie révolution. Et alors non pas parce que la technologie, la science a énormément progressé sur les dernières années, même s'il y a une accélération, c'est aussi lié aux questions de financement de l'écosystème. Donc aujourd'hui, des tas d'acteurs du venture capital se sont détournés des questions d'investissement classiques, probablement aussi pour des questions un peu d'assèchement de la tech, puisqu'une fois qu'on a ubérisé sa maison, son chien, ses enfants, tout ce qu'on a pu ubériser, il reste plus grand chose à ubériser, bien que je dis ça à chaque fois, mais ils arrivent encore à trouver d'autres choses à faire. Et donc aujourd'hui, il y a un investissement massif qui va être fait sur des problématiques sociétaux, aussi parce que les besoins ont changé. Et ça, c'est l'avantage de la question de la deep tech, puisque vous savez, la deep tech a 3 conditions. Elle a une condition, et ils vous le rappelleront aujourd'hui, une condition d'investissement qui est évidemment majeur en termes d'argent. Il y a une condition de recherche, hein, s'il n'y a pas de, j'allais dire, de soubassement technologique, de recherche pointue, ce qui fait que ce n'est pas accessible à tout le monde. Hein. Ce sera aujourd'hui, dans ces 4 jours, les questions du forum, mais tout n'est pas forcément accessible. Lorsqu'on parle du quantique, vous l'avez vu, c'est compliqué. Lorsqu'on parle d'une technologie, c'est compliqué. Lorsqu'on parle d'un principe de brevet, il y a des éléments qui font que la barrière à l'entrée n'est pas simple, mais c'est ce qui en fait la valeur. Et puis la troisième composante de la partie Deep Tech que l'on a vu émerger, qui fait cette transformation entre les Deep Tech et ce qui était la science technologique, c'est la notion d'impact. Hein. C'est-à-dire qu'on voit des technologies, et ça Greg de Temerman va beaucoup nous en parler, c'est des technologies autour des questions climatique, autour des questions de santé, autour des questions des grands défis. Hein. On a assez peu, j'allais dire, ou on n'en a pas d'ailleurs, de deep tech pour les questions de trading haute fréquence. Ce n'est pas l'objet. L'objet, c'est de répondre à des grands challenges sociétaux. Et c'est pour ça que une des thématiques aujourd'hui va être sur la question de l'énergie. Voilà, donc c'est encore une fois l'occasion de remercier aussi les équipes, remercier Wim, remercier les équipes de PariSanté Campus qui nous accueillent ici. Évidemment, voilà, on aura l'occasion d'échanger tout à l'heure autour d'une pause café. Et voilà, et on va continuer avec Greg de Temerman qui vient tout juste c'est d'abord les étudiants. D'abord les étudiants. Voilà, je leur laisse tout de suite la parole. Et encore merci.
Donc, bonjour à tous. Nous sommes très heureux de vous accueillir ici parmi nous, au sein des locaux de PariSanté Campus. Donc, et nous voulons également remercier Greg d'être parmi nous, et également Wim, Benjamin et Cédric pour cette année auprès d'eux. Et donc nous allons aborder donc l'impact de la transition énergétique et la décarbonation sur les secteurs du transport. Voilà. Donc je te laisse te présenter.
Pour nous présenter, moi je m'appelle Moïdine Webi, chercheur à Chimie PariTech PSL et entrepreneur. Je suis spécialiste en chimie séparative des métaux. Je m'intéresse particulièrement sur le recyclage des métaux rares et des métaux précieux qui se trouvent dans les déchets d'équipements électriques et électroniques. Actuellement, je travaille sur un projet de création d'entreprise visant à recycler les lampes à LED et à récupérer les métaux qu'elles contiennent.
Alors, pour ma part, je m'appelle Jade Alumani, donc je suis passionnée par l'entrepreneuriat et l'innovation. Je suis également spécialiste dans le conseil digital, dans la stratégie d'entreprise et également une appétence pour le web dev. Et donc j'ai un projet professionnel qui est dans la digitalisation et une forme novatrice dans la livraison. Mon objectif est de concevoir une solution numérique et innovante, de répondre également aux attentes des clients dans leur expérience utilisateur. Donc, le réchauffement climatique. Mesdames et messieurs, donc nous sommes vraiment aujourd'hui confrontés à un grand problème, donc le réchauffement climatique. Donc les températures moyennes de la Terre ne cessent que d'augmenter d'année en année. Donc les gaz à effet de serre dans notre atmosphère sont de plus en plus présents. Et c'est là dû au transport, à nos industries et également un tas de facteurs qui fait que ça ne cesse d'augmenter. Cela émet donc du dioxyde de carbone, du méthane et d'oxyde nitreux qui contribuent à un phénomène qui met notre planète en péril.
Alors, bien que l'effet de serre est un phénomène naturel dans lequel les gaz naturellement présents dans l'atmosphère piègent une partie de la chaleur émise par notre planète, cependant, l'augmentation de la concentration l'utilisation des énergies fossiles et des autres activités augmente la concentration de ce gaz dans l'atmosphère et piège une quantité excessive de chaleur et perturbe ces phénomènes, d'où une quantité de chaleur est piégée par notre atmosphère au lieu d'être réfléchie dans l'espace. Comme vous pouvez constater de ces graphiques, en 2020, nous sommes toujours dépendants de l'énergie fossile, comme le pétrole, le gaz naturel et le charbon, qui représentent à peu près 28%, 16% et 2,5% de notre consommation d'énergie primaire, y compris dans notre quotidien, pour produire l'électricité et pour alimenter le transport. Par contre, en France, on ne suit pas les mêmes schémas. D'où parce que, en fait, nous sommes basés sur le nucléaire pour produire l'électricité. Mais le premier émetteur, le plus grand émetteur des CO2 en France, c'est le transport, qui n'est pas le même schéma dans le monde entier. Parce que, en fait, dans le monde entier, le plus grand émetteur des CO2, c'est le transport et la production de l'énergie. Et ce n'est pas le cas en France. Donc, le transport tout seul représente 43% des émissions de CO2. Donc, l'accumulation de CO2 dans l'atmosphère va piéger la chaleur émise par notre planète et causant une augmentation de la température terrestre et des graves conséquences comme la sécheresse et risques élevés d'incendie. En parallèle, la fonte des glaces conduira à une élévation du niveau de la mer, menaçant les populations côtières. Voilà, nous avons abordé les grandes lignes de notre présentation et pour aller plus en profondeur, nous avons fait l'appel à un expert dans le domaine, M. Greg de Timmerman, Head of Science at Quadrature Climate Foundation, qui va parler sur l'impact de la transition énergétique et la décarbonation sur le secteur du transport.
Et
donc, sa présentation sera diffusée en anglais. Pardon, sa présentation sera en anglais et sera diffusée sur YouTube dans le cadre de l'Université européenne EELISA.
Et également, donc, l'innovation technologique et les startups Deeptech ont un rôle crucial à jouer. C'est pour cela que nous avons invité parmi nous aujourd'hui Nicolas Malheur, cofondateur et CEO chez Datapred, Julien Etienne, CCO chez IVIA, Antoine Serfon, consultant scientifique chez Type One Energy, et Bruno Ademar, cofondateur et président chez Sublime Energy.
Pour vous donner un aperçu du déroulement de la journée, nous allons enchaîner tout de suite avec l'intervention de M. Greg de Timmerman. Ensuite, après une pause café, nous allons aborder la table ronde avec les professionnels. Et à la fin, nous allons terminer la journée avec un déjeuner suivi d'une discussion autour des stands qui se trouvent juste à l'extérieur. Voilà, l'ensemble du master spécialisé entrepreneuriat, Deeptech et innovation vous remercie pour votre participation.
Merci. Et n'oubliez pas de faire un petit tour auprès des stands qui se situent près de la pause café, s'il vous plaît. Merci.
Donc, on laisse la parole à M. Détournement.
Ouais. Une petite précision. Donc, Greg, il va faire sa présentation en anglais. Il y a une raison pour ça, parce qu'on a un partenaire EELISA, donc les personnes sont là-bas, université européenne, qui vont diffuser la présentation de Greg dans les réseaux européens. Donc du coup, on va utiliser la langue anglaise. Mais je pense que ça ne pose pas de souci pour vous. Et vous pouvez toujours poser de vos questions en français. Et puis Greg, je te laisse te présenter. Et c'est pertinent aussi parce que maintenant tu es à Londres.
Good morning, everybody. So I do live in London. Well, no, I don't live in London yet, but work in London. Still have a French accent, so you have to bear with that. I've been asked to talk about the energy transition in the transport sector, and we will see why it's important. I start with that animation, which was published a couple of days ago by the NASA Visualization Lab, which shows you on 1 year, 2021, the accumulation of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Right. So what you see, I hope you see, are the gases. So you have different colors because of different sources. Most of them come from fossil fuels. You also see in green flashing sometimes the absorption by land and biomass, basically. So it just shows you a couple of things. Of course, everything comes from the northern atmosphere because that's where 85% of the world population actually is. But you can also see how things are mixed. So wherever you are emitting CO2, it ends up warming the full planet because the atmosphere is really well mixed. Just find this animation pretty cool. So what are we going to talk about? How is the transport sector evolving? What are the trends? And what are the challenges? Because transportation is 97% dependent on fossil fuels. So this is dependent on a dense source of energy, right? And this is something which is not easy to replace at once. Although things have changed quite a lot in the last 10 years, let's say, and many avenues are now opening which we didn't think was possible in the past. So just to start with, an introduction has been done on greenhouse gases. We are emitting right now about 45 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. If you account for methane, nitrous oxide, all the other gases we emit, it's about 59 gigatons of emissions per year. Since 1850, we have increased the concentration of CO2 into the atmosphere by 50%, right? So a small species like us, the average weight of a human is about 76 kilos. We have been changing the atmosphere quite significantly, and that means the heat balance of the Earth is actually disturbed. Now, one thing which is very important to understand with climate change is the level of temperature you get. So global warming is the measurement of a global average temperature on the Earth, which doesn't tell you everything because it's only an average. It's directly proportional to the amount of CO2 we put into the atmosphere. This has two important consequences. The first one is that it defines what we call a carbon budget. That means how much CO2 you can emit before you reach a certain global warming level. The second one, which people tend to forget quite often, is as soon as you stop emitting, climate change stops. The temperature stabilizes extremely quickly, right? As soon as we stop emission, climate stabilizes. That's very important because that means there is no inertia. Whatever you do today has an influence today on the climate. So that's very important to act as fast as possible because there is no legacy effect. We are paying the price quite quickly. What do we have to do if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees, which was the lowest target in the Paris Agreement, is basically to decrease greenhouse gases emission by a factor of 2 by 2030. So it's only in 7 years, right? And then go to what we call net zero in 2050 or so. Net zero being something which people don't necessarily understand so well. Net zero doesn't mean you don't emit at all. It means that you are still emitting, because some processes will still emit CO2 and other gases, but you have ways to absorb it from the atmosphere. And that is what we call negative emissions or carbon dioxide removal, which is something which basically doesn't exist right now, and this is something we have to develop. IPCC estimates that you need between 5 and 15 billion tons of CO2 to be drawn down every year if you want to get to net zero. Right? That's a significant amount. Last year was about 200,000 tons of CO2 being directly emitted, taken from the atmosphere. And I'm counting here only non-natural solutions. So trees are nice, but they don't do what we want, which is storing the CO2 forever. Basically, or fundamentally, climate change is the problem of us taking fossil carbon and putting it into the atmosphere. So it was stored there for millions of years. We are burning it and putting it into the atmosphere. We have to, at some point, do the inverse. We won't be able to do everything inverse because we have emitted about 3,000 billion tons of CO2 since 1850. It's a huge amount, but we have to start drawing down a little bit. So very important to keep that in mind. So we have to act fast and at scale. Speed and scale are the two words you will always hear whenever people talk about climate change, because you have to go big and you have to go very fast. Why are we talking so much about energies? Because roughly speaking, 75% of the greenhouse gases emissions are coming from energy uses, taken very broadly, right? Everything we do requires energy. 80% of that energy is from fossil fuels. So basically, for as modern as we think we are, with modern laptops, which I connected from the first time, which is pretty much of a performance, we are still a civilization based on burning stuff, right? That's how the economy works. We just burn things, the same thing we have been doing for the last 10,000 years. We have better converters now, so we have pretty efficient machines, but basically we are still burning stuff, things we found underground, right? Which is pretty amazing if you think of it. So basically we have to change the entire energy system, and an energy system which has evolved relatively slowly over the last 200 years, even more, and we have to change it in about 30 years or so. Now, if we look into that, transport is about 16% of global emissions, which is quite significant, and most of it is from road transport. Aviation is about 2%. This is only CO2 or greenhouse gases. I will talk later on about non-CO2 effect. Shipping is at about 2%. Keep in mind always that the error bars of those numbers are really huge on aviation and maritime transport, because we don't really know what's going on with the particles we are emitting at the same time, so it's really quite tricky business. If we were to look at Europe, we will see a much different picture, because Europe has less emission from electricity and we have less heavy industry, so transport is a much bigger share of the emissions. Interesting to note that emissions from transportation have increased relatively quickly as well over the last 30 years or so. It's typically a growth rate of about 2% per year. 2% per year of growth does mean multiplication by 2 every 35 years, right? So this is quite significant. And you see that road transport is really the big one, and we start to see some what is called indirect CO2, which is basically CO2 emitted for electricity production. So we start to see the effect of electrification coming up. So just coming back to that, 80% of our energy, primary energy, which means the way you find it in nature, comes from fossil fuels, coal, gas, and oil. It's about 15 billion tons of those things we are burning every year, right? It's gigantic. Keep in mind we are 8 billion people on this planet, 15 billion tons of fossil fuels. That means in average we all burn 2 tons of them per year. Perhaps less coal in France than in other countries, but we still buy a lot of stuff which is made with that energy. If we want to be serious about climate, this has to go down below 20% in the next 30 years, which is something which has never been done. If you look at how the curve actually increased, so this is the share of fossil fuels in the energy mix. It has increased relatively slowly, although quite fast in some respect, but we have to go down much faster than we went up, which is always quite a trick. Now, whenever you look at how we are going to transform the energy sector, the first thing that people are converging more and more about is we need electricity. Electrify everything is the big mantra in the US. I think we should start looking at it in France. Electricity is roughly 20% of our final energy right now in Europe, so a small share. In fact, 80% is coming from other sources. It has to go above 50% in the future if we want to be serious. Why? Because we know how to produce electricity without CO2 or minimal emissions. And also electrification usually brings you huge efficiency gains. Think of an electric car, much more efficient than an internal combustion engine. Heat pump, way more efficient than a gas boiler. So electrification usually comes with a lot of efficiency, which helps us a lot in both decarbonizing and reducing the final energy demand. And this is a paradox many people haven't yet grasped, which is we will need much more electricity in the future, but that will mean less final energy being used. Right? It's not totally clear. And if you followed the discussions in France in the last 2 years, people have got all confused about that. But all scenarios are saying the same thing. The share of electricity increases from about 20% to above 50%. This is the IEA scenario, net zero by 2050, but you see that in all scenarios. And then mechanically, without any magic, right? It's really electric cars, heat pumps, building insulation. You are decreasing the amount of final energy you are going to use, right? Nothing magic, no magical technology. Although in some sense one could say a heat pump is kind of magic, right? But it's only thermodynamics. So this is something to really keep in mind. We need to electrify as much as possible. Everything we can electrify, we should. And all the other things we'll have to find ways to do to decarbonize, which is not going to be easy. Another thing which is very important is we have everything we need to decrease emission by a factor 2 in the next 10 years. All the technologies are there, are known, they need to be deployed as fast as possible. They can be improved, yes, but they are already available. Electric cars, heat pumps, insulation of buildings, changing agriculture, changing the way we eat, all those things we know how to do, right? It's a question of scaling and being serious about deploying that. Now, the further we go into the future, the less we have the solutions we need. And the IEA estimates that 50% of the emission reductions we need in 2050 are going to come from technologies which are still in development today at different levels. They can be pre-commercial, but they can still be in the lab, which is why deep tech or climate tech, as we call it, is very important because we have a lot of technologies to develop. And then you will say, oh, this is a techno-optimist talking, but just tell me how you are going to decarbonize cement production, right? Cement, 4.4 billion tons of cement we use every year. How are we going to do that? We don't know exactly. We still need a lot of work to do that. Still, well, we think we are going to use hydrogen, but there is a lot of progress to be done before we can do that at scale, and perhaps this is actually not even the best way, right? So these are fundamental things. Ammonia. 200 million tons of ammonia being produced every year, which is why you got breakfast this morning. 50% of the world population is alive because we have ammonia, which is the key ingredient for synthetic fertilizers. Well, we don't know how to decarbonize ammonia production so far, right? So this is not about fancy applications. This is about the basic stuff we need. Steel and concrete. Everything around you contains steel and concrete or has been done with steel. Ammonia, well, this is why you have croissant at breakfast, right? This is quite serious stuff. So we still need a lot of innovation, and we should really try as many things as possible because we don't really have the luxury to pick a winner. I think this strategy that Europe sometimes has about, oh, we'll pick which technology we prefer is kind of is born to fail, right? We don't have the time, we don't have the luxury. We have to try things and see which one is going to win. And at some point, when we see something is really clearly winning, then we should help it to scale it as much as possible. But picking a winner too fast is the best recipe for disaster. The best example of scaling is, of course, renewables, which are scaling at an impressive pace since the last 5 or 10 years, which is aided by the fact their costs are falling, which is a new paradigm into the energy system. The cost of technologies are decreasing with deployment, which is basically learning rate. Every time you double the installed capacity of something, the cost decreases by a certain %. For renewables, you're typically, or for PV, you are typically at 15-25% of learning rate. So every time you double the capacity of installed solar panels, your cost per panel decreases by 15 to 25%. This is quite impressive. PV, last 10 years, 90% of cost reduction on a given panel. If you go back 20 years, it's about 99% cost reduction, right? Something that nobody has seen coming. And I could show you a few graphs showing how people have predicted the cost and how costs have evolved. Nobody got even close to it, except one guy who claims he did, but I can't find any proof. And those things are deploying extremely quick, and not quickly enough yet, but PV deployment is on track to what IEA says we need. Wind is kind of behind what we need to do. And wind, as you know, is facing a lot of difficulties, right? Last year we had presidential election. Whether you were for or against wind turbines was kind of a marker of where you were onto the political scale, right? Unfortunately, this has a lot of social resistance we need to find. I'll skip that, but it's very important to realize one thing: fossil fuels, if you account for inflation, their cost has been more or less constant over the last 150 years. Right? Over very volatile, and that's a big problem because we can't predict the prices, but more or less constant over the last 150 years. Why is that? Because it's an extractive industry, so you extract deeper and deeper, so in principle it costs you more energy and more money, but then you're getting better and better at it. Just look at the progress made in shale gas, for example, quite incredible that a couple of weeks ago a company said they can produce shale oil in the US at $30 a barrel, right? Which nobody thought was possible 5 years ago. So all in all, those things have kind of compensated. Prices have been very volatile, but they have compensated. Now on renewables and other kind of technologies now where we know how to be modular, costs go down. And that's very important because that means at some point new technologies become cheaper than the incumbents. And that, if you believe in markets, that means people should look at the cheapest thing, right? So that's a very interesting signal. And everything diffuses across a S-curve. I won't go into the details, but unfortunately we are quite far. So we can look at the transition in two ways. This is a story of exponential deployment, and this is true for electricity, for cars. I'll talk about that later. But there's also the question of the stock you have to replace, and this stock is actually enormous. There are 1.4 billion cars in the world right now, right? So even if you sell 10% of EV every year, that means you have a long way to go to replace all cars. So we are going fast on many things, and I think people don't really realize how fast things are moving, but the system is so huge that by definition it is going to take some time. Right, so transportation. Just a couple of things to resituate where we come from, because this is not totally normal that we can take a train from Marseille to Paris, which I did this morning. When you talk about transportation, it's always nice to try and play it by the last minute, right? So just on time delivery of a speaker. So we didn't used to travel so much. There has been a big explosion of travel as soon as we managed to develop engines. First things we did, of course, is develop the steam engine, and then the first transatlantic ship with a coal engine was in 1838. Sorry. The first thing we tried to do with rails is to actually transport coal, because coal is hard to transport with horses and so on. So we tried to be more efficient. So the first railway in the UK was actually transporting coal from the mine mouth to a city. And then starting from there, we became more and more efficient. And this is showing you the total amount of kilometers of railways being installed from 1850, almost nothing, to 1930. You see 60 years, and you are above 1 million kilometers of railway lines being installed. So this has been going extremely quick. Once we know how to do something, we perfect it to the depth, and then we deploy it quite efficiently. And of course, everything has been permitted by one thing, which is the steam engine, which is, if you have done a bit of thermodynamics, that's kind of interesting, because this is by nature converting heat into motion. This was something that people looked at for a long time and was very difficult. Thomas Newcomen started in 1712. There were a few prototypes before. For the first time, he managed to heat something, boil water, get steam, and then convert the steam into motion. Those machines were extremely inefficient to start with. Newcomen's machine is typically reported at 0.5% efficiency, which is 99.5% of the heat you were creating was just lost to nothing, right? Which is why people were actually saying those things might need more coal to actually operate to help you remove coal from a mine. Then the big change came from James Watt, 1769, 20 kilowatts, so relatively low power still. A huge gap in efficiency, factor 4, but we are still at about 2% of efficiency. But from there, up to 1900, then we went up to 17% efficiency. Now we are starting to talk, right? Those machines are becoming quite interesting, and you can make a lot of things with them. So again, every time we develop something new, we are pretty good at making it as good as it can be. And of course, what was interesting for transport is the internal combustion engine, right? So the Otto cycle, the first engine developed with a liquid fuel. First car, whether you want to call it a car or not, 1896, Benz, 560 watts. So this is less than 1 horsepower for those who want to talk in this unit. So almost no power at all. It was just enough to go around a block with this kind of carriage. Same year, Daimler Maybach, a bit more power, 4 wheels, and then this is the advent of internal combustion engines in cars, and then we started to become much more mobile, and we made those things much more efficient. Just showing you the evolution from 1950 to 2016 of the total miles traveled in the US. You see how strongly it has increased, factor 7 multiplication in 60 years. Much faster than the evolution of the population, number of licensed drivers, so people just drive more and more. And they also get more and more cars, so most households in the US have at least 2 cars. Just to give you a figure, in 2017, we estimate that there was 1,500 billion kilometers traveled on the road in the US. And it's kind of an amazing number if you think of it. And if you look at the number of billions of liters of gasoline consumed, this is quite important. And then we started to become hypermobile. So the car allowed us to travel long distance, but you need a road. And then suddenly you can start transporting goods. on those giant tankers. You all have heard about Evergreen and Everace because sometimes they got stuck into canals. Those things are monsters, 400 meters long, 60 meters wide. They are powered by the most efficient engines you can find in the world, right? This is typically close to 50% efficiency. Those things we think are burning crap or whatever they can find, and you think they are just old engines. These are the most efficient things you can do, mainly because of a ratio of between surface and volume. But those are 80 megawatts. Those are monsters, and they never fail, right? They just keep running and running and running, and that's why having a shirt, you can have the tissue made in China, the buttons made in Thailand, and you transport all of that across the world, and it does cost you hardly a few % of the cost, right? This is extremely efficient. And you put a whole lot of things on those things, right? This is 14,000 standard units, which is about 7,000 trucks equivalent in France. So this is a whole lot of things you are transporting in with one ship. And of course, after that came the gas turbine, which allowed us to have efficient planes. This is an old plane, but typically you have 2 gas turbines in a plane. These are the same kind of gas turbines you can use for electricity generation, not that different. We just use them for flying in this case. 40 megawatts during flight, 60 megawatts at takeoff. So that's no surprise, those things can go fast when you start them, right? Very efficient. Same thing, the failure rate of those things is like 0.0001%, right? Those things are extremely reliable, which is a difficulty in the energy transition. We want to transition to another system, but you have to be as reliable as the previous system, because nobody wants to go in a plane and go back 70 years ago when you were not sure whether you would arrive or not, right? I mean, you can choose not to fly, but if you go in a plane, you kind of want to go to your destination by nature. So this is something you really have to think of when you want to talk about decarbonizing aviation, is how do we make sure this is as reliable as possible, as safe as possible. And everything has been permitted by one thing, which is what we call the energy densities. How much energy do you store in 1 kilo or 1 liter of fuel? If we look at coal, typically we had a big jump between coal. So I'm talking here about a good bituminous coal, not the lousy lignite that the Germans are still burning to produce electricity, which is hardly as good as wood. But if you take a good quality coal like we had in England or in France, typically this is twice the energy density you would have in dry wood. And then we went to liquid fuels, which is typically another factor 2 higher in terms of energy density. So you're starting to pack significant amount of energy in a given mass, which you need if you want to fly, right? Because mass or weight is your enemy there. And that is going to be a bit of an issue because batteries, as good as they get, they are still extremely low in terms of energy density. Now, might not be that big of a problem for everything, actually, that's what we are finding out. But this is something you have to live with, right? I mean, a battery electric plane to go from Paris to London, to Paris to New York is not going to happen so soon, right? Because you have factor 40 difference in energy density. So the big joke is, if you want to go from Paris to New York on an electric plane, you need 2 planes behind you with batteries, right? So this is going to be one of the issues, and the other issue is also that those things we can store. We can store fuel or oil for a long time without having any trouble, which for batteries it's an issue, for hydrogen it's a nightmare. All those things have to be worked through. Okay, let's start with cars. So what are the trends we can see happening? So I'm calling that a car because that's what the US... so this is the most sold car in the US, right? You might hesitate to call it a car. It's about 3.5 tons. It has a very cool technology. I mean, it has a big battery which can work both ways, which means if you go camping, you can actually probably power the whole campsite with it. So it's pretty cool, but it is extremely heavy, and that raises a question which always comes in transportation is, do we really need those things, or can we make them more efficient and smaller, right? This is a big question. We are a little bit less prone to that in Europe, although the average weight of cars in France has doubled in the last 50 years. Remember the old 2 chevaux? Sorry, I'm talking to old people only here. Compare that to the weight of a Clio or whatever you have now. This is twice the weight, right? I mean, even in Europe, the cars have become bigger and bigger. Still not there, although in the south of France we do see a lot of those babies, but quite interesting. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I was young, we were people were arguing about whether we wanted battery cars or hydrogen cars, right? Can you use hydrogen in cars, fuel cells? So basically you store hydrogen, you recombine hydrogen with oxygen to do electricity, and you could have a car. You typically need 1 kilo of hydrogen to make 100 kilometers. So in principle, that's quite attractive. Now, this is a comparison between the sales of battery electric vehicles and hydrogen cars, right, on the same scale. So I think 15 years later, we can just say that the match is gone. Anybody trying to sell you a hydrogen car, just don't listen, unless you want a supercar, right? Something which can drive to 300 kilometers for 1,000 kilometers, which is useless because you can't do that. But basically, this is quite interesting because there was a lot of technical arguments. Batteries were kind of favored, but people were afraid that the battery density was not high enough and they were way too expensive. We know how the story goes now. And I think there is no turning back. The only real serious players in hydrogen cars is Toyota, and they just announced that they are going to scale back because nobody buys them. And even if you buy one, there is no hydrogen fueling station anywhere anyway, so it's not easy to come buy hydrogen. Last year, 13% of new cars were either battery electric or plug-in hybrids. So this is quite impressive. You see the share is increasing quite fast. And this is globally. So if you look at countries like France, we are above 20%. In many countries, you are above 30%. So this is going extremely quick. I mean, the electric car is coming. And this is kind of hard to see how it's going to stop now. I mean, this is there to stay, I think. And this is a very interesting evolution. Now, of course, the problem is you still sell 87% of internal combustion engine cars, and you have a stock of 1.4 billion cars to replace. So the question is, how long is it going to take to replace a significant chunk of electric existing park? Now, I just want to make one point because people argue all about that. Yes, electric vehicles are better in terms of CO2 emission if you take the whole life cycle, right? There's no doubt about it. Don't let anybody tell you the contrary. You need a full coal-powered country to be having an electric car worse than an internal combustion engine. It's full stop, right? There's no discussion there, and it's getting better and better. We know that batteries are more energy intensive. That means during the construction of a car, you emit more CO2, but as soon as you drive it, you compensate quite quickly. In France, that's typically 20 to 30,000 kilometers before you're on par with a diesel car, and then you get your benefits. So yes, this is a good solution. Of course, one can discuss whether we should have 1.5-ton cars or smaller cars. That's another issue, but equivalent cars, it's way better to have an electric car. And I just showed also what the IPCC has to say about it, where it's a complicated graph. It basically tells you that you need a full coal mix if you really want to. So this is the emissions for diesel car, and these are the emissions of, where is that? Sorry, I'm lost on my own. Here. This is emission of electric vehicles. Of course, there are a lot of data there. But this is if you have 100% coal electricity. So you see that you're only reaching the level of diesel if you have close to 100% of coal electricity, which nobody has anymore. So very important to consider that. There are other things we have to consider with electric vehicles, but in terms of CO2 emission, we know the story and we are pretty confident. Now, this has all been permitted by one thing, which makes me kind of wonders. I wonder about why people don't talk more about it, but maybe because I'm just biased. The progress in battery technology has been totally breathtaking in the last 10 years. I don't know that people realize that the average energy density has more than doubled in the last 10, 12 years, right? Which is quite incredible. So this black line shows you the average battery density you have in your EV car over the time, and you see you typically have a doubling over 10 years, 10, 12 years. And many technologies are coming up. And this has many consequences. First of all, is for a given weight, you gain more range. And we know that range anxiety was a big problem at the beginning of EV introduction. So this is already relieving the pressure because we know we can now make an EV with 400 kilometers of range. And then you can wonder whether you actually need more. Even in the US, people find that you can actually live with that, although they do like taking long trips. The second thing, which is quite interesting, is that we are moving from technologies which were containing cobalt to technologies without cobalt, which we call, for example, lithium iron phosphate. So this is a different battery chemistry. The reason is that we want to, cobalt has a difficult supply chain, so we want to get rid of it if possible. But when you take off cobalt, when you decrease the energy density, so you get into those kind of pinkish points here, which are slightly lower density. But I want to draw your attention to one thing that people have not realized, I think. Take the state-of-the-art LFP battery here, and you just follow the curve to get the equivalent NMC battery, so state-of-the-art, you're only going back 3 or 4 years, right? So that means, and those technologies are still progressing, that means you are not making a step back by having batteries with lower energy density, because the energy density is still much higher than what you had 10 years ago. And then it's less expensive, and it's based on more abundant materials. So this is something which is a game changer that people have not realized. In the last 3 years, the share of LFP batteries in EVs went from about 15% to about 60%. This is incredible how fast the battery manufacturing has adapted to new chemistries, and they keep doing that, right? This year, we will start seeing cars with sodium-ion battery. So you replace lithium by sodium, you lose a bit of energy density again, but again, you're only coming back a few years. So given that it's less expensive, you can mass manufacture it, you have less problem of lithium abundance, which is not a problem of abundance so much, but in terms of supply of lithium. Then again, this is something 10 years ago people would say, no car will have a sodium-ion battery, not possible, not gonna happen, right? First models are on sale in China, just wait for them to come in Europe. Right? So again, this is what amazes me is that we keep talking about technological breakthroughs, especially when we talk about deep tech, right? We like talking about, those breakthroughs we want to develop and so on. When there is one, we don't see it. Batteries is a good example. Solar panels, right? Again, old enough to see people think, those things will never work, too expensive, not efficient enough. They keep progressing and they keep getting cheaper. So just keep that in mind. And then we know that if we start having silicon-based anodes, we are actually going to push up the energy density on the other way. So a lot of things are happening. The battery chemistries can change quite quickly, which means you can take a lot of improvement as you go along, which is quite impressive. What time? Yeah. And I think in terms of battery, we are where we were 10, 15 years ago with PV, which means people have neglected how strongly the cost reductions will be and how fast the technology would evolve. Showing you a paper published in 2021, comparing in pink the actual evolution of battery cost per kilowatt hour, and then all the projections made across the years. Typically, nobody has been able to predict the price evolution of batteries for more than 2 years, which is not really a prediction, right? Because you know it's not going to change by 100%. So, and we had exactly the same curves for PV. So it's quite interesting to think that people are really bad at estimating that. And what that means is that we basically create an echo chamber, because we are convinced that those things are not evolving fast enough, and which means we are not necessarily adopting them because we think they are not good enough and they are not cheap enough. And in fact, they are evolving faster than what we think and what we consider. Now, of course, last year was a bit of a step back because of cost of materials and so on. So battery prices increased a bit last year, but we see declines already this year happening. People have managed to get back on track, materials have gone down in price, and people are becoming more efficient at producing them. One point also is, yes, an electric car does need more metals than an internal combustion engine, we know that. Typically copper, for example, you do need quite a bit of that for the engine. And for the transmission, you need lithium, you need nickel, manganese, depending on which chemistry you're using for the battery. So yes, it's true, you need more metals to build that car than a conventional car. Just don't forget one thing, is that your diesel car is burning a whole lot of fuel in its lifetime. So I've taken an average Clio, 6 liters per 100 kilometers of fuel consumption, 200,000 kilometers a lifetime. This is 600 tons of diesel you're going to burn over the lifetime, right? Which is the equivalent of 4,000 barrels of oil. So yeah, you need more metal on one side, but you are burning a whole lot of stuff on the other side. So we are asked to think about where we come and where we are going. The metals have the advantage of being recyclable in principle. We are not doing enough, but we can do more. Once you burn oil, it's gone, right? So you're burning your resource, which is quite precious. And then you're just putting it into the atmosphere, which is going to annoy us for the next 1,000 years or so. So it's kind of a silly thing to do if you think of it. Now, another thing that battery technologies have allowed is trucks. So the war on cars is lost, right? I mean, again, anybody, and we know that one of our previous ministers is president of a hydrogen car company, which actually is kind of going under now, but whatever. So the race for electric cars is won. So electric cars, battery electric cars have won. They need to be deployed. We need to really think about the role of cars in cities, because I don't think it's normal that there are so many cars in Paris or London. It doesn't make any sense, but that's another discussion. But we know how to electrify road transport. And then people are saying, well, okay, but now trucks we cannot do with batteries, too heavy. We are going to have too much weight penalty. Range, we'll never get the range we need because those trucks are traveling so much on Europe and so on. Well, in fact, now you can prove that you can electrify a big chunk of the trucks in Europe and at a cost competitive, at it being cost competitive. So there are typically 4 options if you want to have what we call zero emission cars, which is not a good name, but that's what Europe is using. So you have fuel cells, so hydrogen trucks. You have the Tesla truck, which is basically a battery electric truck. You have biogas. And you have catenary trucks, which are electric, have a smaller battery, and are basically doing like trains. They are taking electricity from another line, which is quite interesting in principle. The question is, to make them happen, you need to develop a whole lot of infrastructure before actually people will take that. And we are in a catch-22 situation where nobody wants to invest in the infrastructure, which means the truck manufacturers are saying, well, I'm not going to do a truck for that because there is no way to use it. So nobody wants to do the first step. So very interesting in principle, but nobody is going to do it. And that means basically you are left with, so biogas, I think there are better uses than, or biofuels, there are better uses than trucks. I don't think that's the best use because this is a relatively limited resource and you don't necessarily want to burn it in trucks when you have alternatives. So it leaves you with hydrogen, which gives you a lot of range, or batteries, which is true, are more heavy. Now, the first thing to realize when you look at it is that 62% of travels done in Europe are lower than 400 kilometers per day, right? So trucks are not driving so much when you think of it. 4 kilometers per day you can already do with existing battery technologies. So typically you can already electrify 62% of the trucks which are actually traveling in Europe, because most of them are stopping by at the depot in the evening, so you can charge them during the night. And the autonomy is good enough in what you want to do. Now, with some progress in battery technology, which we are seeing now, and technologies also progress in terms of how we design the trucks. People have this image that you take a truck and you just add the battery. Well, you don't do that. You just remove all the transmission, which is pretty heavy on a truck. You can simplify. You can, in principle, put engines at the wheels directly, not having a transmission. So when you do all of that, the weight penalty has disappeared. So you can take a better battery and a heavier battery, and then you can go up to 80% of the trucks, in principle, being cost competitive again, which is something nobody would have thought 10 years ago. The only ones you are really annoyed with, and remember that a driver in Europe has to stop 45 minutes every 4.5 hours. So that means you have a 45 minutes window where you can charge truck. The only ones which are really annoying are those trucks which are crossing Europe without ever stopping because they have 2 drivers. So they just keep changing the driver and they only stop for 5 minutes or so. For those ones we have to think carefully, but this is only a small portion of the trucks. So what that means is one can debate about different things, but depending on how technologies improve, you can start taking more and more of the shares of trucks, and even specialized trucks like heavy construction, urban construction, garbage trucks. You can start electrifying all of them. And the advantage with trucks is that their lifetime is relatively short, typically 7-8 years. So you can see a big change relatively quickly because the lifetime is not so long. While a car is typically 12 years, a plane is 20-25 years. So you have a strong inertia. You don't have that in trucks. What is also interesting is we see more and more manufacturers switching to electric. So less and less announcements about hydrogen trucks and more about electric trucks. We know buses are electrifying really quickly, which is quite impressive. I think 60 or 70% of the buses sold last year were electric in the world, so that's going extremely fast. And in terms of cost, we can calculate that this is, when you take the total cost of ownership, this is quite, we think by 2030 it will be economically attractive to have a battery electric truck rather than a diesel truck. So you are on par quite quickly. Now the hard one, flying. That's probably the hardest thing to abate in the world, to reduce emissions, because you need a high density fuel. And those things have very long lifetime, so you're not going to buy a new plane just because people want you to decarbonize. In addition, this is a very complicated thing because this is not only about emitting CO2. Aviation has a lot of effects onto the climate. We don't necessarily understand them all fully. But the main effect that you have all seen are those contrails being formed, not the chemtrails like that all the complot-like people like, but really the contrails, which are basically water vapor condensing behind a plane and forming a long-lasting cloud, which tend to quite interesting because during the day it does reflect the solar light, so it has a cooling effect during the day, but a warming effect during the night. So it really depends also on when you fly about what is the effect, which makes it a bit difficult to predict. Then we also those things emit a lot of soot particles because of incomplete combustion of kerosene, although it's improving. They emit sulfur oxide because there's always a little bit of sulfur in fuels, although this is also decreasing. So all in all, this is a very complicated picture. And what people don't necessarily always realize is that what we call the non-CO2 effects, so the effects, the climate effects coming from other things than CO2 emissions, are typically very close to what we expect from CO2 emissions, which means just decarbonizing is not going to be enough if you don't do something about those other effects, but which are very difficult to actually both predict and act on. Turns out that if you use sustainable fuels, you're actually decreasing particle formation, contrail formation, so you might be doing a lot of it at the same time, but not everything. And aviation is an interesting one because fuel efficiency has improved drastically over the last 50, 60 years. This is probably one of the fields which has evolved the fastest in terms of energy efficiency. But in the last 60 years, the traffic has increased by 15, the factor of 15, right? So you are getting better and better in terms of fuel efficiency, but you have more and more people flying, so that does cancel quite a lot of your effect. And this is the biggest problem with aviation, is how do you decarbonize something which is growing at 3% per year? That's not an easy one because you keep selling planes. You might have heard announcements by Boeing and Airbus saying that they think next year is going to be a record sale year for planes. So you are putting a whole lot of new planes into action. One option is to use what we call sustainable aviation fuels. So these are fuels which are done from biomass. You transform the biomass and you do fuel. You can also, in the future, it's not happening yet, but you could capture CO2 from either the atmosphere or at the exhaust of a smokestack. And then reconvert it into fuel. That is expensive in terms of energy, but things are getting better. And for something which is as specific as aviation, that might be the only way forward. The problem, and the Boeing CEO said it again 2 weeks ago, we don't see that being cost competitive. So the cost of jet fuel is too low, and it's not clear that in the next 10, 50 years we will be able to match the cost of jet fuel. So that does raise the question about increasing costs, which might not be a bad thing because it's not totally clear that it's normal to pay 20 euros to go from Paris to Roma, but this is something to take into account because this has a big impact on the economic model of those things. You also can have some electric planes on small lines and so on, but really for the bulk intercontinental travel, you will need a liquid fuel. Some people are going to say, oh, hydrogen, but we don't have any single hydrogen plane flying, right? And I think Airbus is planning one in 2035, and that's only one, right? And you need to replace the whole fleet. And then the last one, which is actually causing a lot of discussions if you follow the news right now, because you might know that the amount of sulfur allowed in shipping fuels has been decreased significantly in the last couple of years, and this sulfur oxide that you emit has a cooling effect on the climate. Right? This is what some people want to do with solar radiation management. You just put a whole lot of sulfur oxide in the troposphere, and then you basically reflect solar light. And we can see clearly that the sulfur emissions from shipping has decreased, and some people think that what we are seeing now in terms of warming, this year is pretty warm, part of it might be due to that, so decrease in shipping emissions. Not clear, not everybody agrees, so I will not put too much faith right now on it, but this is one thing which people are looking at. This is something which is increasing quite quickly. 90% of the goods you are buying are typically transported by ships, which is a huge volume. 11 billion tons of goods we are transporting every year, which is quite something to decarbonize. And again, those things are pretty inexpensive and reliable. And this is something which is on a strongly upward trend. So this is again something against you have to fight. It's interesting to follow the competition about who has the biggest boat, right? Every year a new ship comes which is bigger than the previous one, which is quite amazing at some point that those things still float. Not everybody agrees on the way to go. It's going to be probably a mix of things, biofuels, using ammonia and burning ammonia, using hydrogen in fuel cells, perhaps using methanol, which is done from capturing CO2. Some people think you can perhaps electrify, again, because batteries are quite better than they used to be. And also because weight doesn't matter so much on a big ship, because you are transporting so much weight anyway, so you can have a lot of batteries and not have too much of a penalty on that. So, but this is also a very difficult one to decarbonize. Only good thing is 40% of the maritime traffic in terms of shipping is for fossil fuels. So it's us transporting oil, coal, and gas. So if we reduce those, we also reduce part of the traffic, which might not be a bad thing. And last thing, I'm sorry, it doesn't show up so nicely, but I focused on the technology side because that's what I was asked to talk about. But of course, we have to think about the system itself, right? I kept saying that cars, probably we should think about their use and their place in cities and so on. So there's a strong discussion about how we want to have an efficient system. And I just want to remember, because people will ask me, oh, what about the demand side? We should decrease the demand. The IPCC has this beautiful graph, which shows better in their report, but which shows that decarbonization typically has three pillars. The first one is what they call sociocultural factors, your choices, right? What you decide to do. Second one is infrastructure. Whatever you want to do, you need an infrastructure to go behind. And the third one is adoption of technologies. You want people to use e-bikes or electric cars, while you need to help them to adopt them, especially at the beginning where they're more expensive. You want people to use bikes in Paris, well, you might as well plan some bike lanes, because otherwise it's kind of an adventure to take a bike. You want people to take metros, buses? Well, if there is no metro or no buses, it's going to be harder, right? So always have to think about things into a system. It's not enough to say, well, we do less because you are working in a system and you want the system to change. And in terms of cities, that means how do we think cities in a different way so that public transports are much more dominant than cars and that pedestrians, bikes and so on are actually also favored. So you could say, oh, I don't like a bike. The bike is the most efficient way to move from point A to point B, right? Up to a certain kilometers, of course, but this is the most efficient, even more efficient than walking. The only time where it becomes worse is when the slope is higher than 10%. So think of it as, in terms of energy efficiency, you're way better taking your bike than taking a car, which is 1.4 tons for 76 kilos of human flesh. Right, so I don't know if I have been too long, I hope not. I hope it did give you a flavor that there are a lot of things happening in those technologies, which is quite impressive. I don't think we pay attention enough to that. Doesn't mean the transport sector is on track. We are still lagging way behind what we should be doing, but at least we have the tools now to start doing a lot of what we need to do. And the question is, how do we accelerate the trend so that we actually get somewhere in the end? Happy to have any questions. Shout if you're not happy. Try not to throw anything. That would be nice. Thanks. Am I even more? Oh, yeah. Okay. Does that work? No, it doesn't work. I can yell. Okay.
Here, yeah. I think in your slide on the shipping, I didn't see one thing. I claim we know how to decarbonize shipping. It's called nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Why have people not? Are people working on that?
No. Simple as that. Why? Regulation is a trick. How are you? It's easy when the military is in charge because we know who is responsible. Remember that most of those ships are registered in small islands for tax reasons. How are you going to enforce nuclear safety laws in things like that? So, yeah, in principle that's possible, and perhaps we should work more into it, but that means you have a whole lot of reactors starting to not fly, but to circulate around, and I'm not sure everybody will be comfortable with that. And really the question is, how do we track the nuclear material, and who is responsible when those ships are registered in islands where nobody knows what's going on? So I think, yeah, technically possible. I don't see that happening, and we don't see anybody really jumping at it. So I don't know.
So first of all, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting, on top of, for once, not having a very catastrophic scenarios and hearing about what's going well. I meant to ask you about
kind of well, right? Let's
kind
not-
of.
let's
But
not
there are good
oversell it.
news as well. So now we know that battery have a twice better density in 10 years. So thank you. I will remember that. But my question was mostly about net zero. How do you think we can do that? Any examples?
That depends on your timeline, right? I mean, net zero is possible. The question is how fast do you want to get there? And that's the trick we are having now, is the realization that 2050 for net zero is extremely difficult, technically possible or plausible, but feasibility is very difficult because this is something to do at a scale we have never done before. So that does raise a lot of questions about what we think we are going to be able to do. Now, it's not a technological question, it's a question of policies. Are we going to be finally serious about doing something? Are we going in Europe to stop talking about subsidizing coal power plants, which is still being discussed right now in the European Parliament, right, in 2023, where we know coal is the most emission-intensive technology? So I think that's where the question is. I think the technologies will come for most of it. So for the bulk of the emissions, we know where to go. There will be some things which are going to be difficult. Aviation, shipping. I think steel is going to remain quite difficult. I mean, decarbonizing the full steel industry in 20, 30 years is hard. Cement also. But that means you are basically already abating 80% of that, right? And if we have already done 80% of the path, that's already something. But we can see easily, even in this country, that this is not going as fast as we should, right? I mean, nobody wants to really have hard discussions about if you're opposed to renewables, you're just part of a problem, not part of a solution, right? Because timeline-wise, there's no way to do around that, right? Timeline-wise, there's no way to go around electric vehicles because you're not going to change cities in 10 years. We know that. So yes, perhaps it's not the perfect solution, but at least this is something you do. And in the meantime, you try to change cities, but cities have a pretty long lifetime. It's the same thing with building insulation. If you go to China, look at how bad not our buildings are not too good either, but their buildings are much newer. But still, insulation, thermal insulation is a catastrophe, right? I mean, I'm about to live in the UK. It's like prehistoric ages, right? Middle Ages in terms of insulation. Many houses don't have double glazing, while we know how to do triple glazing with gas inside. So it's a question of us not being serious enough, in fact.
Thank you.
Bonjour, je vais poser ma question en français. Quand vous avez évoqué les comparaisons entre batterie électrique et véhicules électriques et véhicules thermiques, vous avez évoqué notamment le nombre de composants et de métaux nécessaires pour le véhicule électrique. Et vous avez évoqué le fait que, contrairement au diesel, par exemple, on peut recycler. Que répondez-vous à des personnalités qui ne sont pas chercheurs et qui ont tendance à faire tout leur discours sur la finitude des matériaux, sur les limites planétaires des matériaux, empêchant parfois même la réflexion sur ce sujet? Est-ce que le recyclage est un horizon de recherche et d'innovation et jusqu'à quel point est-ce que des matériaux recyclés sont toujours aussi performants?
Okay, so I have to be careful because there's a metal expert in the room, so I have to watch what I'm going to say. First of all, the fact that there are limits tells you something and tells you nothing, right? The question is, what are those limits and how far are you from them, right? So we always have to be careful about this argument, but the Earth is limited. Yeah, of course. Doesn't tell you anything, in fact, I think. So, right. So let's be a bit careful about that. Recycling is possible. Batteries are being more and more recycled. The question is a question of lag, right? You are developing the technologies fast and then the recycling kind of lags behind. In fact, right now there are not enough batteries to be recycled because it turns out that they last longer than we thought originally. So the recycling industry is kind of struggling to get batteries. Some people were proposing we just build batteries to give them directly for recycling so that they can practice, which tells you something. And then there are a couple of more questions. There's the question of recycling is interesting if the concentration of the metal in a given alloy is higher than what you would find in a mine, right? So there's a question of energy. Is that easier to recycle and extract the metal from an alloy or a component, or rather than doing it directly in nature? So this is also the way we are designing things. We have to think more and more about how we are going to recycle those materials. And the third thing is we perhaps also have to think about how much we use. I mean, again, a 1.5 ton car does need a bigger battery than a 1 ton car. And so it's also a question of how much we use so that you decrease the stock you need, and that facilitates a bit. I don't think the economy will ever be 100% circular because thermodynamics tells you can't recycle. Well, you can recycle everything, but it's going to be an increasing energy cost. So at some point, it's just not worth it. But if we're already recycling more, that would be something. Look at aluminium, copper, iron, those things we already recycle. They are less complicated, of course, but so it's developing. People are thinking of it. There are more and more laws being put in place so that people start to look at recycling. There are quite a few exciting companies working in that space about making the processes easier. So it is happening. We have to be careful always about not condemning something which is starting, right? We can't. It's not because you don't recycle enough batteries now, but it's not going to be the case in 20 years because we know we have to do something about it. So, yeah, I see where you are pointing, but I think we have to be a bit open. And again, one thing which I want to remind people is if you start looking only at data which are 5 years, 10 years old, you're out of date in this field. Things have been changing quite a lot and people don't realize that. So it's not like the industry is standing still. A lot of things are actually happening. Europe has a recycling act right now. Okay, now I'm going to be contradicted.
No, I'm just going to ask a question. Just to come back to the battery technology, you have shown the evolution of the battery technology, and you said LFP is becoming more and more common. There is a big advantage because you eliminate cobalt, nickel, and so on. I heard before that there was a disadvantage in energy density versus one point you have discussed, but also in cost because you have to grind it very, very fine for LFP technology. Do you have an idea about that? Did you check about the production costs or not? Maybe the question is too precise.
It depends on. So yes, the processing does cost a bit more. The materials cost much less. So all in all, the manufacturing cost is lower. So you spend more on ones, but you save on something else. So all in all, it's better and it's improving quite rapidly also. So something to take into account, but seems to be going pretty good so far.
Okay, but in any case, I think it's a huge advantage that you only use iron and phosphate.
And your lifetime, I didn't say, the lifetime of LFP batteries is much larger. You can do much more cycles, which means it's a big advantage because you can keep those for longer. It's actually, so coming to your point on recycling, sorry. One reason we don't have enough batteries to recycle is because we have a second use market now. So in a car, typically you consider the battery to be dead when it has less than 80% of the initial charge state, which first of all means you could still run it. There are some safety concerns, but we think we have a handle on that now. But you just now put them on stationary storage. And we see a lot of batteries having a second life, which means they don't get to recycling, and people didn't necessarily anticipate that, which is quite interesting that we can make those things last longer than we thought at the beginning.
Yeah, and I had a second question about the battery. You said that the first batteries with sodium ion are on the market now. Did you check if this technology will be, if we will be able to produce these batteries with the same industrial plans than the one we build today to produce lithium batteries?
More or less, you don't have to adapt so much because you are changing only the ion, and this is an LFP battery. So it's an LFP battery, but you replace lithium by sodium. That's at least the ones which are being sold right now, which means most of the fabrication chain stays the same. We don't have so much details yet about those technologies. I mean, the first ones were really commercialized now, so everybody's kind of fishing for information, and the main player is CATL in China, which is known for not being too good at communication. But it doesn't seem that they constructed so many new plants to get there. So it looks like they can just reuse a lot of it, but I don't have all the details.
Okay, thanks. If I can just add something on the recycling, I think you didn't say that there is something very important, or you said it, but I wasn't attentive, which is that as long as you have growth, you always have a problem. Yeah. Recycling will never be enough. And if you take copper today, we have approximately 20% of the copper demand today, which is satisfied by copper which is recycled. And basically, we recycle about 40% of the end-of-life products with copper inside. But as the lifetime is about 30 years, the demand has doubled. So you recycle 40% of what you have introduced in the economy 30 years ago, and it's only 20% of what you need today. And this is typically what's going to happen with the batteries. Yep. You see the trend of the evolution of the electric vehicles, and even if there wouldn't be a second life, 10 years ago you had 20 times less electric vehicles than today. So even if there wouldn't be a second life, you would have the need for 19 times more lithium than the lithium and the cobalt and so on that you can recycle from the batteries. So there is a real problem during the ramp-up period. Once you have developed 1.4 billion cars,
well, less, I hope.
All electric, I hope also less, all electric, then when you can hope that you still have only the metallurgical efficiency in the reprocessing, and you can hope you will be very close to something like 90% of recycled material. But you have all that period during which you develop, and the situation is very different today for products which are mined since decades, centuries, like copper, and products that we really started to mine seriously in the 20 last years, like lithium.
Merci beaucoup pour cette question. Je pense, anyone wants to ask here? Okay.
Je vais parler en français. On se base beaucoup sur l'électricité, mais l'électricité, on n'en a pas et on n'en aura pas. L'éolien, ce n'est pas un problème, c'est pas une solution du fait de l'intermittence. On ne sait pas stocker et on ne saura pas stocker à court terme. Donc de l'électricité, on n'en a pas et on n'en aura pas. Donc tout ce qu'on bâtit aujourd'hui, c'est sur du sable, moi j'ai l'impression. Alors, deuxième remarque, à propos de l'hydrogène, vous avez dit que l'hydrogène, ce n'était pas une solution pour les voitures. Ce n'est pas une solution, c'est un non-sens. Il y avait une émission à la télé l'autre fois, la conclusion, c'était hérésie pour l'hydrogène. Donc ça coûte une fortune, c'est pas un problème, c'est pas une solution ni écologique, ni économique. Voilà.
Okay, so 2 points. First of all, I'm old enough again to remember those people 15 years ago swearing that 10% electricity from renewables on the grid will never work, the grid will never be stable, right? Remember that? Remember when we thought wind will never work at more than 10% on the grid? Look in the world, 40%, many countries have 40% and they do just fine with their grids. So let's be a bit careful about one thing, which is we never had to play with intermittency before, not so much because we were adapting to the demand, right? So we just adapted the supply to the demand, and that's how we build the system. That doesn't mean it has to be like that all the time. You can do the opposite, and that's what we start to do. So let's be a bit careful about all of that. And that's the same argument that people say, oh, sun only produces during the day. Yeah, we know that, right? I mean, we know there is no sun during the night. We know that, and we know that when we do the modeling and the systems design. That is part of the trick. But that means you will have to shift some of the demand to use electricity when it's available, right? And I think the belief that the energy transition will be you won't see any changes in your uses because you are used to a system is just a total nonsense. Full stop. Second point. Intermittency says something and nothing. Variability is a point. The question is, can you predict it? It's not a question of whether it varies, it's a question of whether you are able to predict it and adapt for it. Looks like we are getting better also on that. And again, I don't think we have seen a blackout recently in Europe, despite all the wind we have. I don't think we have seen a blackout because of the solar we got, right? We adapt to that. Just look at what the UK is actually doing on the energy system. So where I agree with you is we have a problem in the amount of electricity we have. And that's something that I was very critical when RTE published its studies 2 years ago. Many experts said, this is too shy. RTE, so the RTE, the grid management system in France, was way too shy into its prediction in electricity demand. And then we started to get into that mode of, oh yeah, that's going to be fine. 2 years later, they just updated their numbers where what they estimated for 2050 is now in 2035. We have an issue. So we have to build as fast as possible electricity. Is that going to be a bottleneck? Yes, I think clean electricity is a bottleneck. Doesn't mean we should not do that because we know how to do it. So yeah, we are electricity constrained, and that means we have to make choices. That's where hydrogen should not be used for cars, because producing hydrogen requires 55 kilowatts hour per kilogram, so that's a lot of electricity. You don't want to waste it in something like that. Now, I would put a little word of caution on the fact, I'm also saying that, but I think we should be a bit careful about one thing. Yes, in the next 20, 30 years, hydrogen has no place in cars because of limitations everywhere. Really long term, I think we should not be so categoric. We don't know, right? It might be that the very long distance future, we can do high temperature electrolysis at high efficiency, and then we have enough electricity and we can do a lot of things. So let's be a bit pragmatic there. We never know. I mean, there is nothing more difficult to predict than the future, right? So short term, and I think the TV show you showed us had me for a minute or so into it. Yeah, so right now for cars, it's not a point. We should look at where to do. But I would really push back on this electrification, because if you don't electrify, what do? You burn gas, you burn oil, you burn coal. So we have to electrify because we have two effects at the same time. We decarbonize and we get more efficient. But that means, again, people have to be serious and have to stop saying wind is useless. It's not useless. We know how to use it. Whether you can go to 100% renewable, I'm not convinced. But most studies show, first of all, I have a student finishing now, it just ended in his thesis today. We looked at the estimates of storage needs in a high penetration system of renewables. So what happens if you have 80-90% of renewable electricity on the grid? How much storage do you think you need? In the last 15 years, all the estimates have gone down, again, because we know how to manage the grid much better than we did 20 years ago when we didn't have to do it. So it's not that we are getting better, it's just that we are doing something which we didn't have to do in the past. So that means you need less storage, which is quite good, because that means we have more time to develop storage. And storage, long-term storage, become really important only when you reach 70-80% of renewables on the grid. We are not there yet by far, so we do have a lot of leeway before going there. And last point is, I'm happy for people to say we need nuclear, and I say it, but we can't bloody build those things. Simple as that. In France, we are not capable of building a single nuclear reactor right now. And Flamanville is a fucking disaster. And the next ones, which are still not ordered, which is a shame because we keep saying, oh, this is urgent, we need to do that. We know EDF doesn't have an order yet. People think you're not going to get there before 2037, before 2040, if you're a bit realistic. So what do we do in the meantime? We have nothing else. So we have to do with what we have, and we have to learn from it. But last thing I'll say is really, we should stop thinking about the energy transition or a decarbonized system as the way we are thinking about the current system. It's going to be different. It doesn't mean we are going to suffer. Just means that perhaps your water boiler will run during the day rather than during the night. It's just because we adapted to something.
Any other question?
Yes, it's a question about the industrial and the technological independence around the batteries. So we see mostly China and the US dominate the sector. So do you think what's your advice on the evolution? Is there still some place for innovation for Europe, or are we condemned to see our big manufacturer dependent on the innovation of other continents?
Well, I don't have any advice to give to anybody. Let's start with that. It's a good question. There are a lot of discussion, especially since the Ukraine war, about independence or resilience of our supply chains. And there is a very strong argument to be made that perhaps we should be a bit better at controlling our supply chains for critical things like batteries, electricity, renewables, and so on. That's not happening right now. It's moving. France is about to open a new gigafactory for solar panels in the south of France. There's a couple of discussions about gigafactories for batteries. So there are a lot of things. The Industrial Clean Industry Act, I can't remember how they call it, in Europe is trying to push for that. there is a lot of political will to do, but Europe is actually facing a little bit of an issue, which is that our energy in Europe is extremely expensive right now. It's better than it was 6 months ago, but it's still quite expensive. And we are facing the competition of US, which has really cheap natural gas, unfortunately. So it's going to be a question of will, whether Europe has the will to do it or not, and whether we can also kind of secure our energy system so that the energy prices are not making our industry suffer. And that's also probably going to go through what we call the CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is how do we start leveling the playing field so that you don't delocalize somewhere where people don't care so much about emissions and then you penalize your own industry. This is a discussion. Europe had a carbon tax for a long time, still has a carbon tax, but it's starting to think that, well, we have what we call carbon leakage. So people go around to manufacture something and then you re-import it into Europe and you don't count it into your emissions. So it's a question of whether people will agree on that. China is really adamant against CBAM, and you can easily understand why. But it seems to be moving ahead, and if that does, it does change a bit the discussions. But at some point also there's a question of cost. Can you compete in terms of cost with China? Should you? Perhaps we should focus on other things that we can't do. But I think we know because of the geopolitical tensions that we need to be careful about the supply chains for energy because it might be a big issue in the long run. And that's the issue with minerals, for example. Who produces them, who refines them, and where do we get that? I think people want to go for coffee, not someone?
No. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have one question about one chart and one curve that I have in mind. It's something that we learned at school, and for me it was 25 years before, that each time you discover a new form of primary energy, since the beginning of Drake, and then you have oil, and then you add coal, and then you have a new form of energy, and gas, and nuclear, and so on. And each time this is this primary form of energy, and you don't reduce the previous one, you just add to the global mix, and that means that if you look about the curve, it was still at the same increase about the primary energy. But as you mentioned, and the world is going to be an electric world, that means that it's going to be a more efficient world, because as you mentioned, we are moving from things to not to boil all the stuff and to move to an electric world. Does it mean, and I know that future is a difficult thing to predict, Greg, but because you are part of the team of experts in the red team, probably you will have an advice on that. Do you think that in the next future, probably it's possible to have a decrease on the primary energy demand at the worldwide level?
Right, I actually removed that slide in the train. Right, so I'll use that one instead. Yeah, so historically, this is true. Every time you find something new, we just add it to what we add, and then everything keeps going up. So that's true, and that's a problem when you want to transition. This is becoming not true anymore. Last year, if only nuclear had produced more in France, that would have been the first year in the global history that renewables addition would have sustained the additional demand for energy, which is kind of a tipping point. And we think it's going to happen this year or next year. So we think we are at the point where this is not accumulating anymore. We will start to see some substitution. Now, of course, one can say that every year, but there is a change there. Second thing is, one should stop talking about primary energy when we talk about the energy transition. Primary energy is, for being a bit less technical for a second. Primary energy is defined as the way you find energy in nature, right? You take a lump of coal, typically 30 megajoules per kilo, so you say, well, I have 1 kilo of coal, I know how much energy is in there. So this is the way you find the primary energy. But we don't use primary energy, right? We don't use coal like that, we convert it, so we use other things. Now, in a system which is going to have to run away from fossil fuels, primary energy doesn't mean anything. This is an accountancy norm, because we talked about wind energy. What is the primary energy of a wind turbine? Is that the wind which comes before and then that you convert into electricity? But who cares, right? The wind is not limited, so it's not a resource. We are not going to run out of wind in principle. So some people say 1-to-1. One unit of electricity produced by wind is 1 unit of primary energy. Some people say no, this is 25% because of the conversions. So primary energy becomes something which everybody uses and nobody knows what is behind. And we have a paper coming out next week which shows that depending on the accountancy norm you use, your primary energy demand in the future will either increase, stay stable, or decrease, right? So what are we talking about? We are not in the physical world anymore, and I'm a physicist, so I'm getting confused. So we have to start using final energy, really the energy we use or we pay directly at the pump. If we do that, there are two things happening. First one is that it's going to decrease by itself because of electrification, assuming we are serious and not adding other uses, right? Also, at some point, we have to start thinking about all those gadgets we use and how much energy they consume. The second thing is, when you talk about final energy, what appeals to you is what we call the primary energy fallacy, because we don't have to replace every unit of primary energy. Again, it's typically, if you look at from primary energy to useful energy, so what you really want. Mind you, what you want is not energy, what you want is a cold beer and a hot shower, right? That's what Amory Lovins used to say, but he still says it, actually, he's not dead. What it means is that you need a service. You don't need oil, you need transportation. You don't need electricity necessarily, you want lighting, you want you want power for your computer, right? So what you want is a service. If you look from primary energy to useful energy, really the service, we are losing 2/3 of the energy in the mix. So even if we go back to final energy, it's still 35% loss. So we don't have to replace all units of energy. And when you look at it, it's a bit different like that when you don't look at replacing all of primary energy. The transition is difficult enough and hard enough and slow enough that we should not start counting things incorrectly and then introduce even more difficulties in the way. So I hope that answers the question, but I think I'm getting a bit vocal about it, but I think people should stop using primary energy, and I think if I was a reviewer in scientific journals, which I do, I refuse papers talking about energy transition and primary energy. It just doesn't mean anything, especially because people don't even define what they're talking about. Just shame. Anyway. Stop.
Merci beaucoup, Greg, pour cette présentation pertinente et intéressante. Merci à tous aussi pour les questions. Je pense maintenant on mérite une pause café pour 20 minutes, je pense. Et après, on enchaîne sur la table ronde.